Coming up on Theater Talk.
The drama of the decline of Bob Hope
Yes.
and staying on too long on the world stage,
Brilliantly told.
stage, is in that book is so beautifully handled and so touching, and I cried a couple of times for him and me. He could not let it go.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation and the Honorable Thomas Mercer Ray.
I may need smelling salts. I just looked in the wings and Bob Hope is standing there.
From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. And Susan, I am in love with show business lore and legends and show business figures, and I love biographies about great show business icons. And I have read an absolutely superb book about one of my heroes. Yes, I confess it. I'm a Republican. This is why I loved him. Bob Hope. I grew up with Bob Hope. I never missed an NBC special as a kid growing up, and I met Bob Hope once at the Republican National Convention in Dallas, Texas, and it was the highlight of my life. Bob Hope is the subject of a terrific new book called Hope by a fine writer and a good friend of mine, Richard Zoglin. Welcome to Theater Talk, Richard.
Great to be here.
And just to, I guess for comic relief, Dick Cavett is here because he knew something about Bob Hope, and he knows something about comedy.
He knew Bob Hope, and he was friends with Bob Hope.
Why did you cut that introduction so short?
Met him first in Lincoln, Nebraska, and last on my show, and the gap between still seems incredible to me. I have a hearing aid, and it sounded like you said you were a Republican. And I almost...
It's true. No, I was fourth graders for Ford. All right, and I was a page at the Dallas convention, '84, when Reagan was recrowned, renominated, and we were in the, I think it was a Trammell Crow Hotel. It's now, I think it was the Wyndham Hotel, and I was 15 or 14 years old, and I'm walking through the lobby, and Bob Hope comes in. He's wearing this, I kid you not, he's wearing a pantsuit. A light pink, light blue striped pantsuit, and he's walking his dog, and his dog has the exact same pantsuit on.
Get out of here now, and we will finish this show.
It's true.
You want to know how I met the great Bob?
Yes.
Hi, this is Bob Boxing Gloves Hope. I met him in Lincoln, Nebraska, the obvious place. He came there with a variety hour. A friend of mine and I went knowing that it would be a film. It couldn't be Bob Hope in Lincoln, because we'd just seen him in Monsieur Beaucaire. And they had a lot of variety acts, intermission. We didn't know what intermission was. We started to go home. We came back, and the second act started, and we thought more jugglers and magicians and dogs. And now the star of our show, Bob Hope. God, and he walked onto the stage. We were at sort of an angle. Seemed to be coming straight toward us. And my friend Lyle Burke said, Jesus, there he is. Nothing but air between us. He was hilarious. We ran around to the stage door afterwards. He came down some steps, and I said, "Fine show, Bob." I was in junior high. And he said, "Thanks, son." The next day, I told all my friends I'd been chatting with Bob Hope.
Yes.
Years later, I look in the wings. Yes, he's there. He's coming out of my show. I told him that story, and he said, "Hey, was that you?"
Well, when I met him, when I went, I said, "Oh, Mr. Hope, could I have your autograph?" And he said, "You're too young to be a Republican."
Which is a great line. And I love, Bob didn't always need his writers. That was a great line, ad-lib line.
But
how glad I am that you said that. I used to get in fights on the playgrounds with kids who'd say, "Bob Hope can't ad-lib," right after his radio show.
Right.
He has these things called writers, and they write down jokes, and he reads them into a microphone.
It's true.
And I said, "You're full of ordure, probably, in fifth grade."
You told me several lines, and Larry Gelbart said to me, Bob's was always funnier than his monologues. Bob in person was funnier than his monologues.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
From Gelbart.
Gelbart, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Richard, the obvious question, of course. I mean, Bob Hope, for many people, is ancient history, represents Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, a lot of stuff that, like, my left-wing crazy commie friend Susan doesn't want to think about anymore. Why were you interested in researching this man's life and bringing him back to, restoring him, I think, the way you have done with this book?
Well, first of all, I grew up loving his stuff, too. I watched those road pictures over and over again. I loved him. I, too, was in that generation that kind of turned off to Bob Hope because of Vietnam and that difficult time. But, you know, I always thought he ought to be, you know, looked at, you know, aside from all the political baggage. Plus, I did this book on stand-up comedy called Comedy at the Edge, about stand-up comedy in the 70s, and I used to ask each of the guys that I interviewed, from George Carlin to Steve Martin through Jerry Seinfeld, I would always ask them who their influences were, who they grew up with, who they loved. Nobody ever mentioned Bob Hope, not once.
Wow.
And that was so, you know, astonishing to me, because I believe he really invented their art form. When you think about it, I was trying to see, I really looked into who really founded stand-up comedy. There were vaudeville comedians before Bob Hope, but they were very different. It was Bob that said to his writers when he started on radio in 1938, you know what, read the papers and give me some lines out of the papers, or stuff that's happening in his real life, playing golf.
Revolutionary idea in
Yeah.
comedy.
Well,
It seems so basic.
Will Rogers.
Will Rogers.
As you make the point, very interestingly, I think, in this book, Will Rogers had the folksy kind of topical stuff, but Bob Hope brought the urbanity, the sophistication, the
And the
slickness
vaudeville
to it.
rhythm, you know, the rhythms, the fast pace and
His
everything.
fabulous diction. He never blows them.
Oh, really amazing. You hear him so much on radio, how little he stumbles. So much so that when he did make a little stumble, he would always make a point of it,
Yeah.
because they were so rare.
Right, right.
Yeah, I heard him say, as if it was, that wasn't a lady, that might, or something sideways like that,
Yeah.
he said.
What was that? There was a line. It was probably written, but I remembered some radio thing where he says, she said, "Oh, some cute girls on the radio," and she says, "Oh, Bob, you're such a ham," and he says, "Right now I'm bacon."
Oh, my. I think I told you this one, Richard, but he came to Lincoln and played a golf game with some Republican friends, of course, and he loved the golf course.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it. And the next day, a snotty little kid said, "How come you didn't see Bob Hope?" And I said, "Bob Hope?" He said, "Yeah." And a kid said to him, because he was wearing a flowing Hawaiian shirt, the kid said to him, "Hey, Bob, your slip is showing." And Hope said, "So is your father's." I didn't get it for about a year.
But Dick, let me ask you. I mean, you're not exactly a Republican, I would say.
Not
Did
entirely,
you
no.
Did you ever turn on Bob Hope? Was there a period where you thought, I'm going to turn on this guy because he's
Turn against
Nixon's
him, you
friend?
mean?
Yeah, turn against him.
No, never. I understood. I knew he was a lifelong Republican. I knew he felt that this country had given him everything he could have wanted and more. He was a patriot in the old sense. And he, like so many, were wrong about the war. We got our butt kicked in. And because it was his habit to go on and defend it. And Kennedy gave him a medal, and he was...
Clinton loved him?
I asked Mort Lockman, his producer head writer, once, who does Bob like? He said, Bob likes any politician, any movie star, any sports star, any Vatican biggie, anybody who's big in influence. And,
Generals.
He liked generals. General.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
you write about Richard, his childhood. He came from England. He was dirt poor.
Yep, he struggled. He struggled in vaudeville. You know, when he got into show business, it took him a long time to make it.
Yeah.
And he started performing on the street to bring money. I mean, there were 7 brothers, and going back to
right.
childhood,
It was not easy. That's where he got that work ethic.
Yeah.
And that he had to really work at it. You know, nothing came overnight and easy to Bob Hope in show business. And wow, he was, a workaholic.
One of the countless thrills of your book, if I may say that with you sitting there, is the way you take us into each of his media, from vaudeville to theater to television to movies, and impossibly...
And TV.
He and television, he goes straight to the top. His television career was largely crap, but his monologues were fabulous. I was even in one of those deadly sketches, but let that
Were you?
pass.
What?
Yeah.
Really? Which
I didn't
one?
see that one.
At the New Orleans World's Fair in a baseball locker room. And I loved seeing him, as he always did. When he came on in a costume, he didn't just come on and start the line. He, like a model, moved around so you could see his costume, and then he started. And gee, that was a dream come true, but that's such a cliche. But what a comedian in terms of technique.
But Richard, I wanted to ask you, where do you think, I mean, having traced his life, going back to his parents, his upbringing, where does that Bob Hope sense of timing come from? Where does it come from and how does it develop?
I guess it developed in vaudeville when he had to, entertain.
But even before
crowds.
vaudeville, there must have been something in the family that...
The timing,
A timing family.
He always used to talk about his father was a very funny guy, but I think that's sort of a cliche. I'm not so sure, how true that is. I think it's a kind of...
His father was sort of a happy drunk, wasn't he?
Yeah, he
Sort of,
was. He
with
was
a-
an alcoholic. Interestingly enough, Bob was never really a drinker.
No.
And several of the brothers were big
Alcoholic,
drinkers.
yeah.
So amazing that he avoided that.
You couldn't have the work ethic Bob Hope had if you were drunk.
No, that's from
No,
the mother.
no.
Yeah. I think timing is a pointless thing to talk
Yeah.
about, quite frankly. I asked,
Good timing,
I
Dick.
drop a name, Jack Benny, and one show, just as the week was going off, I said, they always talk about your timing, your timing. Can you tell us? And he said, kid, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I said, well, what is timing to you? And he said, I say the line the way I think it should be said when it should be said. And if you don't have that instinct, you can't learn timing. You can't learn to count to 3. I mean, it's just,
Except though in your book though, Bob honed his, for lack of a better word, Dick, timing in vaudeville, in front of live audiences,
And part of
taking
it-
their measure.
Yeah, and part of it was confidence too, that he could wait for the laugh. He had to work to different audiences and kind of get the feel of different audiences and how long it took for them to get jokes and stuff. And I think vaudeville, just a guy who has to constantly work to stay afloat in vaudeville. You've got to just constantly be sensitized to every audience and to what's happening elsewhere in vaudeville and how, he would borrow things, he would steal things, he would just do anything he could to
One of
stay
the
on.
other
but
things I
another
find-
person could have gone through all those things and with no instinct,
Yep.
not
Yes,
gotten
and
any
not-
better.
But
But
one of
you're
the
right,
things I
timing.
find fascinating though about this book, because it's in a way it's just bigger than this man. He was somebody who understood the business of show business, how to build himself up as a brand
Fabulous
name.
career management. You say, I think
absolutely.
you say micromanaged his career somewhere in the
Well,
book. Or something.
he did, and he was also the first brand guy. He branded himself in a way that no other Hollywood star, I don't think, at that time. He wasn't just Bob Hope, star of movies and radio, but he wrote books starting very early on, before he was practically just come to Hollywood, and he already wrote a kind of a jokey autobiography. And then his book about World War II, and these were bestsellers. He wrote a newspaper column in the late 40s. He, of course, had a golf tournament named for him. And how many stars had their own logo? I mean, the line-drawn profile with the chin and the nose.
I had said to you earlier that in reading your book, I did wonder, because he from very early on managed this squad of writers and this business. And I said to you, well, here he was raised by this mother while the father was off, drinking the paycheck and all this. This mother is 7 sons who she managed, when brought over by herself in steerage to America. And I wonder if this wasn't, he wasn't looking at how this mother managed all these boys and kept this operation going.
That's a very
7 Little Hopes.
interesting
7 Little
observation. Maybe so. He certainly learned from his mother.
What do you think,
the
Dick?
He learned from his brother, too, who one of them especially,
Yeah.
who out in California in the early days said, it seems to me that this land between Beverly Hills and all these cabbage farms till you get to Hollywood will be valuable someday. And he got some.
He bought most of it. You were around him. I mean, when Bob Hope arrived for whatever taping a TV show, was it like the president had arrived? I mean, was the entourage? Was he?
When he came off the elevator, the place lit up. I mean, it was just that dazzling personality, a fabulous personality. He's a handsome man, too, even though he said, but don't say that, I got to keep the nose jokes. And so, but he was
Did he travel with
a
an
presence
entourage?
you could feel.
Was there an entourage around him when you saw him?
No,
Yeah.
he would come in a Burberry coat, and I held it once and laid it aside for him, and I went through the pockets. There was a package of certs. And then after the show, I followed him down the stairs after saying goodbye to him, and I watched him walk out into 30 Rock and go around a corner like one shot in The Third Man. And I thought, he's going to walk there and people are going to recognize him or not. One day, I'm innocently watching Dave Letterman, and Bob said, Mr. Hope said, "Hey, I'm taking Dick Cavett to the Army-Navy game."
Yeah.
I didn't know it. That's in your book.
That's in my book.
He did take me.
But did people recognize him on the street? I mean, he couldn't go anywhere without it. Like me, a little kid, Republican, you know. Oh,
He
Mr.
knew how to walk in airports. People,
Yes.
you know, he would walk fast, and he would say hello to everybody, but he moved.
And he'd have a hat on usually sometimes.
Yeah.
But now there's a dark side to Bob Hope. And you described, for example, someone said he never apologized, he rarely said thank you, and had an essential coldness to him.
Well, yeah.
And he doesn't sound like he was the best father.
Or husband.
Adopted, no.
Well, no.
In this man's book, he walks into his own home and one of the kids says, "Hi, Bob Hope."
Yeah. Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you are an internationally famous TV star.
Oh,
Is that-
easily.
Yes. Does that come with the territory of being so famous that you become, on
Distant
some
from
levels,
everybody?
distant and aloof and have to, you know,
Swat them away without...
Well, I know what you're saying.
and squire around babes and ignore your family? Is that part of it?
It
Yeah.
can. It can be too hard to handle. The constant recognition is a dreadful bore, but great fun for the first 2 weeks. And after that, it can make you as unpopular in the business as, just to make up a name, Danny Kaye.
Yeah.
I mean, his initials are Danny Kaye. I don't want to say it.
But, you know, I think it was a combination of his English sort of reserve and just a lack of introspection. He was just a guy, he didn't want to talk much about himself or think much about himself, so people who even were close to him didn't feel like they knew him very well.
Yeah,
but
somebody
there
said-
might not have been much to know.
Somebody said deep down inside, Bob Hope, there is no Bob
There is
Hope.
no Bob.
One-
That's
right.
great. And I loved when you pointed out, I didn't know this, that Johnny Carson got sick to death of his coming on the show. Every time he had something to plug, walking in the middle of all the guests is on, doing 8 gags and leaving. And Mr. Woody Allen said to me, "Cavett, do you think you could get him to talk on a show? He swaps gags." And I did.
You did the best of anybody.
I did. And I'd say things like, "How'd you get that scar?"
I lived in Bristol and I protected my dog one day and I got hit with a rock right there. And it's still there. The little indentation there.
He talked like a person, which he could do wonderfully. And yet at one point he gave an answer and he said, "Hey, would you rather have a gag on that?" And I said, no.
But did he become a, I don't want to be too meta, as the kids say, but did he become a prisoner of Bob Hope, the creature he created, that everything had to be a gag?
Yeah, he felt that he was a public figure. He was, you know, more public than anybody, and he just felt he constantly had to support that image.
Why does this happen? Here's a man we talked about who was a great ad-libber, who could ad-lib, in the early career, could ad-lib anything, you know.
Yep.
Oh, Bob, you're ham, now I'm bacon, whatever it is. Why then does he have to be surrounded by a battery of gag writers? And
Well, I don't know if you know, he taped his monologue for Friday on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday, and had writers write new stuff all the time. But yes, he was a man who, when he reached up under a miniskirt of one of his stars boarding a plane, and she turned around and said, "You can't do that," and he said, "Read your contract." You knew he could handle almost anything.
Yeah, but
Well, I just, you know, having to do so much material, constantly
tons.
traveling, you know, 5 and 6 concerts a week sometimes, and not, you know, plus his TV shows. He just had to have that barrage of material. But he was comfortable enough that he knew that, you know, he could ad-lib on top of it if he had to, and he did a lot. But you know, going on talk shows and stuff, he was of the old school. You write stuff and you go on. The idea of what we're doing, spontaneous conversation.
Well, Susan wrote all my gags, which is why I'm so good on the show. Now, we've been plugging this book, but there's this other...
Oh my God, now the show starts.
Rather slim tone, I have to say here. Oh my God, look at how... You haven't changed a bit, Dick.
Those are my Times columns, another wide selection of them.
Dick Cavett
There may
reading
not be a
Cavett.
line in there as popular as the one about Sarah Palin in the first book, which was "She seems to have no first language." But, read Mel Brooks' blurb. It'll only take a second. It's on the cover.
On the cover.
Yeah.
That's on the back.
Back.
The best bathroom reading ever written. Each story takes just the right amount of time.
By the way, for the reader who must buy this book before they do War and Peace or the Bible, in my eyes, the drama of the decline of Bob Hope
Yes.
and staying on too long on the world stage,
Brilliantly
and the
told.
stage, is in that book is so beautifully handled and so touching. And I cried a couple of times for him and me. And he could not
Thank you, yes.
let it go.
Why not? He could. I mean, his life in front of the camera, life in front of the microphone. Just
Yeah, I think he was so driven. You know, this was a guy who thought all the time about his career. This is why he had a kind of impoverished personal life. All he was doing was managing his career all the time, growing up with the kids, and he was running off every Christmas and so forth. And he just couldn't imagine a time, you know, when he wasn't on stage, managing that career.
Oh, you tell about when they forced him to take a vacation, and he went up to Canada and tried sitting out in a boat and throwing the line out and something. He said, "Hey, I had to come back. I heard that fish don't applaud." And
He really,
he couldn't take it. He couldn't do it.
That's right.
Not for long.
He'd get ready to go to Europe or something on a trip in the early days, and he'd book himself in Chicago, Cleveland, and Atlantic City on the way to New York. To
on the
catch
way- on the
boat.
way.
Is that what Jay Leno was like? I mean, because in the sense that there's somebody.
He seems to be addicted
Yeah.
to performing and,
Yeah.
and happy to do it. Joan Rivers, she sought love
Yep.
from audiences.
Yep.
And I stepped in front of an Army audience once at Killeen, Texas, Fort, whatever it is. And they applauded me, and I was an unknown comedian. And the jolt that hit your face, I realized Bob Hope's addiction. And right after the war, an old writer I worked with on the Parr Show said, you know, after the war, Bob was just at loose ends. And he said, I had to drive him to colleges before this was fashionable.
Yeah.
And so he could get another big audience fix.
Right. Those audiences, that adulation, and also the sense that he was really bringing something that those men needed.
There's a wonderful moment in your book, though, which I think really, we discussed Bob Hope, and maybe there is no Bob Hope there, and we can never know it, but I think beautiful scene where he's performing in the north of England, and a troupe of guys, they walk 10 miles to see Bob Hope. They get to the theater. Well, you tell the story.
Yeah, Bob was going to miss them, so they found out. They walked 10 miles to see one of his shows. They got to the show out in some, you know, the moor, in the middle of the moors, and it was an indoor show, and it was full, and they couldn't see him. So they sadly started trudging back, the 10 miles back. After the show, Bob heard about it, grabbed his troupe, hopped in a couple of Jeeps, caught up with the guys, and did a show in the rain for the guys out in the middle of the...
Remind me if I told you this, Richard. It's interesting about micromanaging his life, his health, his movements, his career. I said to him once, you know, traveling that time and the food is so awful, and you get to these countries, and hey, you know what I do? We take a trunk load of stewed fruit. And when I was young and in vaudeville, all the actors went to the worst greasy restaurant. Actors always do. And he said, I didn't do that. You know what I did? You have to say no. I followed middle-aged ladies until they went to their lunch, and they would go to these nice tea rooms, and I ate there, and I saved my stomach that way.
Yeah.
That's because his
his
partner, he thought, died of food poisoning.
died of food poisoning. It turns he really died of tuberculosis, but Bob always attributed it to food poisoning because he was throwing up or whatever. And from then on, he stayed away from the greasy spoons and he ate in tea rooms.
He was already eating for getting to be 100. You know,
Yeah.
it's a
Amazingly healthy guy.
physical phenomenon. I rode with him in a car once from NBC to something else, and he said, okay, here I go. Bob's asleep.
Right.
5 minutes. He
He
could
was
take a real
notorious for being able to sleep, you know.
And then he
drop
could
off.
wake up and be ready to go. All right, before we leave, your favorite, do you have a favorite Bob Hope laugh line, gag, joke, a Bob Hope line?
Well, you have to say the most famous, and probably one of the best, is certainly the Academy Awards, the famous opening of the Academy Awards.
Yeah,
Welcome to
yeah.
the Academy Awards, or it's known in my house, Passover.
Your timing's okay. Dick?
I don't have, that's my favorite also. Yeah. Hey, we call it my house, Passover. And then he'd get this huge laugh, watch his monologues, and then he would do a little weight shift and get another laugh.
Yeah.
He could do, that was a
yeah.
technique I learned and imitated from him. But Just anything that started with, hey, I wouldn't say Crosby's fat, but, you know. What does he order at the bar in the Yukon in trying to look tough?
Well,
is it the milk?
He orders lemonade.
Oh,
That's
lemonade.
the other, from Road to Utopia. He and Crosby are coming to try to impersonate roughnecks, and they go to the bar, and Crosby orders a bottle of rot gut. And Bob says, I'll have a lemonade. Everybody turns and looks at him and he says, in a dirty glass.
That's my favorite.
That's it, all right. The book is called Dick Cavett, Brief Encounters.
What's
Well,
that
and
got
I
to do
want-
with Bob Hope?
May I also say about Dick Cavett that now PBS is running the play Hellman v. McCarthy, which
Thank you for knowing that. Yeah, that's
I watched it
Googleable.
again. I had a wonderful time. Theater Close-Up series has you can go to PBS. You know, what do you call it? Where
Yeah,
you watch
PBS.
stuff when you want to, and
There-
it's there.
Or type in
called to your
Hellman
computer.
versus McCarthy, and in the monologue that I do, as if it were years ago, I do Bob Hope and his shifting his weight and getting another laugh, and it works.
The book is Hope, a terrific biography of Bob Hope by Richard Zoglin. Not only a great biography, but also I think a very good social history of America, because Bob Hope in many ways touched on all that was the 20th century.
It's a book that you want your friends to go home so you can get back to reading it.
Can't beat that.
Yeah.
Richard Zoglin, Dick Cavett, thanks for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Dinelli Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency, and the Theater Development Fund's Technical Accessibility Program, which helps provide closed captioning.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.